Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Uh, my name is Mario D'Souza, and I'm a writer and curator based between Goa and Fort Kochi in southern India. Um, I'm also here today representing the Kochi Biennale Foundation and the Kochi-Muziris Biennale, where I am both director of programs as well as a member of the curatorial team. We have with us today Pranay Dutta, who is our first commission, our first co-commission with TBA 21 stage for the 5th edition of the Kochi-Muziris Biennale, which opens on the 23rd of December 2022 and runs until the 10th of April 2023. I've had the honor and privilege of knowing Pranay since my previous positions at Coach in New Delhi and at HH Art Spaces in Goa, and it feels quite, I don't know, special to be able to work on this really interesting, crucial, urgent project that Pranay has been working on for the past few years, and we're very happy to bring this to both TBA 21 stage platform as well as the Kochi-Muziris Biennale. I'm going to let Pranay introduce himself before we delve further into questions and thinking a little more through his practice and its many concerns.
Hi, my name is Pranay Dutta, and I'm an artist who's based in both New Delhi and Kolkata. Um, my practice sort of examines the complex relationship between terrestrial species and landscapes, drawing from the tension between our exploitative, extractive processes and the imagination or fiction of care, mutation, survival, regeneration, and hope. Mm, it departs from the spilling demands of a technological era that depend on further depleting the Earth's natural resources and studies its vast implications on the future of our ecological systems. So I mostly work through painting, video, generated imagery, and video sculpture, through which I sort of try to evoke a sense of crumbling. Um, I invite viewers to become like explorers or witnesses of an unpredictable or isolating future microcosms.
Pranay, it's really interesting that you speak about witness positions, and I think like this is something that one notices a lot in how you approach your practice, particularly because you take so much from the hard facts of ecological change and in a way present your own worlding through science fiction and science fiction as those presented in video games and simulations, in immersive installations and video sculptures. Maybe you could speak a little more about why this act of witnessing is so important as a meter in your practice.
So yeah, we are all sort of implicated in these processes that lead to ecological violence, right? And of course, like big capitalism is to be blamed for most of what is happening. But climate change sort of continues to affect the most vulnerable people in the world, those which are sort of mostly marginalized and sort of dispossessed. Um, I primarily believe in sort of telling stories instead of stating facts, minor histories and lived experiences, which are recorded in stories and songs, probably traditions, rumors, and remakes.
Maybe let's go back to talking about two different works that sort of form the precursor of Neti, which is of course the work that we present together with TBA 21 for stage. Um, Maybe we could start by thinking about Beneath the Steel Sky, a work that is dated 2017 and that takes its title after a dystopian science fiction video game.
So, yeah, thanks for mentioning Beneath the Steel Sky. I think it was one of the earlier works that really got me questioning, ideas of climate change and submergence of ecologies, and maybe even thinking about conservation in a certain way. So the work kind of looked into how a possible future, in a sense, where uh, it kind of built upon the realities of the present world, where um, due to global warming and due to the rise of water levels, uh, landforms were on the verge of submergence, and there was a need to sort of contain them. It's very speculative in nature that way. I was thinking about what happens if the water level does go up and landscapes need to be sort of contained or sort of preserved in a certain way inside artificial chambers that sort of float around in the sea. So I think the idea of the ocean really comes into play, in that sense, in Beneath the Steel Sky, in a sense of being a precursor to the project that I'm currently working on.
Water continues to be a sort of a recurring metaphor. Like it's both sight, but it's also a feeling. It's a sensation. What also presents a certain kind of an ambiguity, a haze, a rupture for several of these ideas to play out. Like particularly these futures, and particularly in your work, several of these landscapes of the future that we see are devoid of humans. What we're only looking at is architecture and form and atmosphere. um, Maybe you could speak a little bit about what are the various influences and the relationship of water as it emerges, particularly within your practice. And I remember having an early conversation with you about the Sangpo, about Marjali, about Hilsa. Maybe it'd be very interesting if you could speak about that, perhaps.
So there is this old saying in Bengali, which says, "The mountain was once the sea," and it sort of stayed with me for many, many reasons. And amongst these was the thought of the ocean as a sense of finality. Like all of the world's futures will eventually sort of rest at the bottom of the sea. Uh, why the ocean sort of returns to my work in many ways, and mostly as a teller of stories. Uh, if you think about it, water has a sense of memory. It remembers everything that passes through it. Um, and yeah, so and as a precursor to Sundarbans, perhaps like you mentioned, is the story of Sangpo, a river that is known by many different names, including Brahmaputra, before it becomes the Indian Ocean. So somewhere along its course, floats Majuli, which is in Assam. It's like this largest river island on the planet, and people who did not belong were those that were kind of ostracized or sort of exiled. They were sort of sent to this island. And if we think about it, what if this island was a paradise? What if it offered at once the potential to be a land, but also float on water, you know?
And then I believe this island is not very different from the idea of the mangrove, right? Something that is characteristic to Sundarbans. And I remember very early on one of your first research visits, something that we spoke about a lot was the idea of the last mangrove, right? The last tree that holds on to land and thereby holds land, and thereby kind of like protects land from water. Um, and then I remember we spoke a lot more about the idea of these man-made bunkers that are now coming up, like man-made barriers, sorry, that are coming up in place of these mangroves now that so many of them have been destroyed and depleted. Um, Essentially, yeah, I think as we progressed into the idea of Neti as we see it today, in the form of this really eerie, speculative work with a sense of magic realism. Maybe perhaps we could hear a little bit about that journey, about that journey of thinking um, about the ocean, about this land that is very much like tied to the ocean, and about the metaphor of the mangrove before we get into the many conversations we'll have about all the various supernatural, mystical, mythological elements that inform the work.
Right. So the first thing that kind of strikes you the moment you kind of enter Sundarbans, or the moment you kind of take a ferry and you kind of move across water into one of the islands, you're kind of like seeing its borders broken, tattered by these sort of concrete structures, which are sort of, sadly speaking, like sort of the only hope left to kind of sort of protect the low-lying islands from the forces of water. And like it also needs to be looked at in a way that it needs, like, in order for it to really protect it, it needs to be a mix of both, like man-made structures, which is the embankments or the bath, as they call it, and also the mangroves, because the mangroves are the natural sort of dikes that you can think of. But interestingly, like so as I was speaking to the people, like there used to be like a lot of mangroves sort of like protecting it naturally, but due to like sort of commercialization, I mean, people over there really need to like tend they really need to be able to like survive, and in order to survive and in order to sustain, they get into like ways of farming, and there's like fish farming and like all these commercial processes that have sort of entered, and because of which a lot of these mangroves were just cleared out. And the next best option that was available was these man-made structures, which was like the bath. But what's happening is that, like, due to like lack of resources, lack of money, lack of land acquirable land, these structures tend to become steeper, narrower, and then essentially non-functional, because they're not being supported by any other structure or boulders or mangroves on the side. So every time like there's the force of sea coming in, they're just very vulnerable to like damage or breakage, and that's what's been happening over and over and over again constantly. So these embankments have essentially become like markers of geological time, because there have been bands that were created like long back which have already sunken under the sea, and then there's like a new set of embankments that have been created. So it's like these layers of like geological time that can be witnessed the moment you probably go under the water over there. You're going to see like these concrete ruptures just lying there. Um, so yeah, I think that becomes very essential, both the mangrove and these concrete baths, in terms of like protecting what the very little that is left of Sundarbans at the moment.
I think that this is again something that came up in conversations much before another. You talk about the bath and you talk about the mangrove, which reminds me of the idea of dark optimism. And just that, I think like Sundarbans presents a very like unique example of people who are resilient, but at the same time are already like climate refugees in some sense, because several of these islands are either in the process of sinking or have already sunk. So people are moving inland, and it has deeply affected their relationship to nature. And we're also looking at tribes of people that have had a very unique way of living. In fact, like a code of living with nature that is completely disrupted by the rising water levels. And at the same time, of course, the Sundarbans presents the rich, like possibly um, the area has tons and tons of resources beneath it, which is also why like different forms of extraction have started to creep up in these vulnerable lands, including industries and also like like attempts to find oil, etc. And there is a deep relationship, I think, between the death of mangroves and the sudden interest in searching for fuel, or searching for oil, or reclaiming land to be able to build these like industries. Um, Maybe it would be, I think at this point of time, we should also, and I mean, to be honest, I feel like this dark optimism is very well reflected in the work, and I don't, we don't really see a presence, but we consistently feel it through the work. So maybe it would also be interesting if you could speak about one of these characters and tell us maybe perhaps, I don't know, a story about one of these many mythological, mystical phenomenons that become in very ways like both a narration as well as a disruption in your work.
So it's interesting that you say that because when I had gone to Sundarbans for the research bit, I kind of like encountered this man who was around the age of 90s, like he was in his 90s. And when I kind of asked him about the question that, how many houses have you had to like shift from in order to like keep moving away from damage and by the sea. So he really like pointed out towards the sea, and he said that that was where I used to live, and now it's basically like underwater. So that really sort of stayed with me, like and in terms of like when you talk about how this is sort of the supernatural bits, how are they sort of intertwined with ecology? It's interesting. Like, so Bone BB is like this main character. She's basically referred to as the forest goddess, who all the people who kind of work inside the forest, they can be honey collectors, they can be fishermen, they can be, people who are going to like try to search for crabs, or like, these occupational this thing, they constantly seek her blessings before they kind of go into the forest. And also like Bone BB also has to do with the way that um, ecological conservation kind of comes across, because it is said that Bone BB, like before people venture into the forest, they need to sort of like uh, go only in the daytime, not in the nighttime, because so that the wildlife does not get agitated. Or like in terms of like even simple things like you cannot smoke inside, you cannot disrupt any sort of like balance that already exists. And that's how like the story, like even religion and like ecology is interestingly sort of very naturally sort of intertwining there. And it is important that like maybe science does not reach the people, but like the people really believe in the religion out here, and these values are being sort of sent across through like Bone BB stories and her mythologies, which is very well drafted in like the Johar. So yeah, I think that there's a very interesting relationship with ecology and religion that is going on in the Sundarbans. And uh, it's something that really needs to be recorded. It's wonderful. I don't know if that answers it, but yeah, like that's something that I
No,
really
no, that's
felt
very
strongly
interesting
there.
to know, and I think that it is fascinating that you didn't give into the temptation of creating all these characters. You use nature, you use natural elements, and you use everything from like mist rising over water to like a formation of like some kind of like insect life, and as well as the metaphor of submergence, or even I think like for really like for a brief moment you see something like an apparition of a tiger, but you never see the tiger in its whole. So I think it's really interesting to be able to position nature again as the idea of the born baby, or the giver, or the protector, instead of actually creating a character, which is what science fiction would do, or which is what even like video gaming worlds present, right? Like so much of it goes into the making of the character, but it's interesting how you stick to the environment instead of like given to the temptation to like personify, to create some kind of an anthropomorphic, animistic um, being, presence. And I've been meaning to ask that there is a certain sense of abstraction to the sound, and I can't help but notice that these are words, but really stretched, but they also sound like a lament. It sounds like somebody's calling out to the sea, maybe, or perhaps to the landscape. Maybe a little bit of how sound, because I know it is such an important aspect of your work, and you spend a lot of time like planning and thinking through it. Becomes a very important part of this of the sensorial experience of this process of creating witnesses out of audiences.
So, like, I think in terms of the sound, you will notice that obviously there is a very ambient sort of, background that kind of goes on, but then there is like these words that are kind of like spilling into it, and they're kind of like just reverbing inside the space. And like I basically like met a few folk like singers like they there's the story about Duque. Duque is this young boy who sort of ventures into the forest and encounters the tiger, which is Dokhin Rai. Dokhin Rai is basically so the story goes like there's Bon Bibi who's like the forest goddess, and Dokhin Rai is like this character who can take shapes, and that specifically of the tiger. And So basically, how Bon Bibi kind of protects everyone from Dokhin Rai, and that's why people seek her blessings in the first place. So the story goes like Dukhe is entering the forest, and he encounters Dokhin Rai, and then there's an entire song that revolves around how Dukhe is crying out and for Bon Bibi, like in order to like save him from Dokhin Rai. So when I met the singers, they were singing about Dukhe's story, and I think it really related to the idea of Bon Bibi and the presence of the tiger in the Sundarbans. And I've taken excerpts from that and kind of tried to like merge it into the sound as it goes. So yeah, in that sense, it was like really interesting to work with these singers and to know the stories and to like encounter more about like the mythologies and the folklore that sort of exist in this land. And it's quite like supernatural and quite magical if you look at it. Like nobody really like has seen these figures, but then it's just talked about. It's just like how it's sort of fictionalized, and it really is something that the people of Sundarbans really hold close and they believe in it. And it's one more thing that I would like to mention is that Bon Bibi has like uh, sort of it is said that she comes from Medina. She kind of traveled down when the Mughal rulers kind of were ruling in India, and that is how she reached Sundarban. And despite it being of a sort of, Mughal sort of ancestry, like it is worshipped by all, like the Hindus and the Muslims come together, and it is quite something because thinking about the kind of time of communal unrest that our country is currently going through, Sundarbans on the other hand has like both communities sort of coherently worshipping this deity, and just based on those belief systems that it just really comes to life, like the magic and the supernaturalness. Yes.
This is why I think like we spoke about Majuli earlier, because to me, like Majuli is that metaphor, like you want to call it paradise, you want to call it whatever it is that you want to call it, right? At the end of the day, it's a place of refuge, it's a place of equality, because everybody that did not fit, the so-called social civilized world is said to have been banished in some form onto this island, this island of abundance that's floating over the Brahmaputra. And I guess the metaphor of the island becomes very interesting again for Sundarbans. And like, thank you for narrating both these stories that I was not aware of. It's I think that we've spoken a lot about two terms when we've been thinking about this project. I mean, one is of course this resistance, like to resist erasure, but also to in some form honor the resilience of the people, right? Who are like here against the wrath and fury of nature with these cyclones and with constant like flooding and rising water levels at the same time. And they're using everything in their means to be able to extend, to prolong, to delay that submergence. Um, and this delay is something that I think becomes very interesting to Neti, the work that we're talking about, because it leaves us, it just constantly keeps us suspended. Like to me, there's so much happening in the work, and yet there is this feeling of suspension. Um, it's also something that I feel like I've noticed in both Day Zero and Beneath the Steel Sky as well. But there's something really like I don't know, staid and considered and slow about the suspension. It doesn't feel, it's not it's not anxiety inducing. It's a kind of like giving into, it's a kind of surrender. It's into giving. It actually does not play into that dark optimism that we spoke about earlier. It possibly like just accepts its fate, and in that sense like it's quite fatalistic as well. Just to watch the Bon BB sort of like float in water and move away. Like the Born Baby that traveled from Medina and came to Sundarbans is finally like the world's futures at the bottom of the sea. Um, I can't help but notice your relationship to these very specific places, like which are both in many senses like affected by either political or ecological turmoil and and violence, like Kalimpong, Sikkim, um, and now Sundarbans for that matter. Maybe we could begin by just laying the ground of what your relationship to these very specific places, very specific conditions is, and how they consistently return as protagonists in your work.
So, so during my childhood, I traveled to a lot of these places, and not just once. Like since the proximity of it to like where I was situated, like in Kolkata, like these places are quite nearby. And every time we would have like a time to like go down for a vacation, in terms of a vacation, uh, subconsciously I was kind of getting familiar with these spaces. And I think I've been to Sikkim over like uh, 7 or 8 times now. And every single time that I went there, I could see like these spaces sort of like change and get molded by like different aspects. Like there was like breach and like construction, there uh, technological interventions like damming, you know and the landscape was constantly in flux. And over the years, I think as I grew up, Kalimpong and Sikkim particularly, like it really changed the way that it was. And I do have like archives of photographs that, both my parents have been collecting like when I was small. And then as I grew up, I have been, collecting. And I have these as references of, how the spaces have changed. And it's almost like, you cannot recognize it from the way that you look at it like now and what it was like about maybe like 15 years ago. It's completely unrecognizable. So I think that was the first trigger for me, in terms of like entering into the space, like inquiring, being like inquisitive, like, in that sense, like just understanding. I don't think it seeped into my work very consciously, but like it was just a question that kept pondering in my head. And that's where I started looking at these landscapes like much more carefully. And eventually, over the course of time, like I think it kind of did seep into my work. And I started to like sort of consciously question, sort of document, travel, understand further, what are these sort of architectural structures, like you mentioned, or like the kind of in terms of development, in the name of development, even are they even following the environmental impact, EIA law, like where they assess like what are the implications of this particular built construction or building in terms of the environment. Like a lot of it was not being followed, and I think what was really at stake was the people, the places, and it's just a general connection that I had with those spaces, and to see them kind of constantly digress was something that really, got me uh, thinking further more about these spaces as such. And I think Sundarban as well, I read about, so Sundarban has both its territories in India and in Bangladesh, and as you were mentioning like these industrial oil units, like there was this entire sort of catastrophic uh, construction of the Rampur oil plant, which was again completely against like the environmental protocols that need to be followed, and there were like massive protests in Bangladesh regarding the same. So that was another space that was within proximity, like within reach, that I could sort of venture into. Although I did venture into it a little later in comparison to like Kalimpong and the mountains, Sikkim and Kalimpong. But like as soon as I did, I kind of understood the magnanimity of like what was happening there, and I think that again really like drove me towards that, and that's how kind of Neti came into being. I did visit Sundarbans, I think 4 or 5 times by now, and the more I kind of went there, I kind of started talking to the people. Also, my father has been working with like an organization which is trying to support like a certain section of Sundarbans. So I've been able to get a certain sense of how do I say it? A certain sense of access in a way, like where I could like talk to the people there because they were more responding because they were already familiar with me because of my father. So I think that really got me further more involved into Sundarban as a space which is constantly again heading towards a sense of crumbling, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting, no, this relationship between like extraction and leading to a certain sense of hollowness, leading to a certain sense of like crumble, right? Leading to a certain sense of like decay and deterioration, and eventually like moving towards a form of like some kind of a semi-permanent demise, because like ultimately, and we've spoken about this as well in the past about nature taking over, right? Talking about the act of rewilding, talking about the act of the ocean's reclamation of land. So let's talk a little bit about process. So I believe that the idea is to first, I don't know, absorb these landscapes in person and as a person, as a human being, and then perhaps like document them further through the lens of the camera, and then completely like use these as references to entirely remake these from scratch in Blender or computer generated imagery softwares. What does this act of like why recreate and why not use the actual like footage itself? Just a curious question.
Yeah, so I think for me, the first time I encounter a space, I don't really use the camera as such. It's more about just moving around and observing. Uh, Not use the camera in a conscious sense to like document, but like, yeah, it's just about like experiencing the space and like understanding what's going on here, really, And it really like the moment I go back again and again is when I kind of start documenting certain um sections, certain like parts of the landscapes which really like sort of come through with the idea of like uh crumbling, like you mentioned, or like in terms of like even like these architectural structures. So for me, it's important to sort of document these bits and kind of bring them over into the software in order to alter its functionality in a sense. Like they obviously exist in a certain manner in that space. But then again, I'm trying to say a story. I'm trying to like fictionalize it. I'm trying to think speculatively about what kind of lies ahead, and to think about these structures, maybe like even use certain parts and kind of build them up in a way that I imagine it to be in the future. Although it does have its traces to the documentation that I make happen inside that space. So I think it becomes important for me to like kind of play around with those documentations, with those footages, get them into the 3D software, maybe like, change the entire structure, but again, keep like traces of it, like as it is. So yeah, I think that's kind of what the process I'm involved in at the moment.
And is this like whole action of like defamiliarizing or like, making strange or like, completely like um recalibrating an actual structure, an actual like part of a structure or an actual image is also perhaps maybe, I don't know, and I'm assuming here, correct me if I'm wrong, a sort of a way, a sort of a method of coming to terms with loss or like, you know, I can't help but wonder because you talk about fiction and you talk about storytelling, but there's also like a certain sense of like heightening, like how do you to heighten a reality for it to become all the more like alarming to an extent where you think that this is not where I want to be or this cannot happen. So maybe perhaps I don't know, speak a little bit about this idea of defamiliarizing of this act of constantly making strange. And I think that because that eeriness continues, that making strange continues in Neti as well.
Yeah, so like coming to think of it, like yes, defamiliarizing the entire landscape is quite important, but at the same point of time, I think it's important to keep like familiar bits of it, because as I invite the viewers to become witnesses of these worlds, like I don't want them to be completely detached, even though they're coming across something strikingly strange. But then there is that sense of, like I said, trace. Like they'll be able to like step back and say that, I think this space kind of resembles this, the spaces that I've been to. Like for example, in Sundarbans, when I was trying to like construct these worlds, like I tried to keep it close to like despite it being completely like an aftermath or sort of sunken, sort of submerged Sundarbans, but at the same point of time there are certain bits where you can't help but notice that there are these mangroves, there are these boats, there are these sort of embankments, and they continue to live on that space. And that's I think the connection that the viewer has in terms of being in the present time, like even despite the fact that we are kind of speculating the future, but then there is that constant reference or the constant tracing back to like what it is today and how you see it today. I think that helps me to like connect with the viewer in a certain sense. So um or for the viewer to connect with what they're seeing, like the spaces that they're seeing in a certain sense. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pranay, for making the time and for having this conversation with us. Thank you for the generosity of stories and the generosity of like both talking through your process. And we can't wait to present Neti to the world together. So gratitude from both TBA 21 and its stage platform, as well as the Kochi-Muziris Biennale and the Kochi Biennale Foundation. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was lovely speaking to you, Mario, and looking forward again.